So I need to bring the conversation down to, let's say, from a 30,000 foot level down perhaps closer to 5,000 foot. I'm not really going to get into the nitty-gritty details of standards reporting and so forth. There are tons and tons of content and YouTube channels out there that are doing that wonderfully well. But I'd like to talk about two things very briefly. One is the what is risk and reward, and the other is then I'm going into some of the challenges within ESG, understanding your ESG risks. In terms, briefly first, of risk and reward, people see risk and reward, risk and opportunity, two different things. In fact, they're not. They're twins, they're conjoined, they're two sides of the same coin. And that coin is the uncertainty coin. And all uncertainty is just the availability of good, reliable, quality information as we're trying to make decisions, getting from point A to point B. If I'm in London, I want to get to Manchester. The decisions I have to make if I want to get there in 5 hours as distinct from 3 hours are different. So at an organizational level, to the points made earlier from Mervyn and Steve, you know, if we think in terms of value generation has two halves, value creation and value preservation. The value creation folk in an organization are clearly focused on keeping the cash cow alive and nurturing that, preserving the reserves for the rainy day, but then selecting certain opportunities and taking risks to exploit them, because without that, we don't get growth. But those same people will mandate that there is a zero tolerance to any risk taking in IT systems, data privacy, IT environment, and so forth. So you get this yin yang, as it were, of value creation and value preservation. And it's all directed towards the journey towards fulfilling our purpose, but those objectives we need to achieve. Business objectives, ESG objectives. So think of risk and the management of risk as follows. Every time we're making a decision, we're managing a risk. Because every time we're making a decision, we are doing that in the context of trying to achieve something. To get into some kind of risk jargon language to segue into ESG, in the risk world, we talk about rhinos and black swans. Stars and mirrors and all of that was taking place over the previous decades. Really, those epidemics, we could describe them as a gray rhino, this big beast, looking very docile, quite sleepy, grazing away on the plains. So docile, you feel you could walk up to it and stroke it until it turns on you. And when it turns, you run, because it will just run you down, it will kill you. And really, COVID-19 was that gray rhino. We always really saw it. Pandemics were discussed, but we didn't really believe it. But then the black swan appeared. What was the black swan? It was the previously unimagined consequence, global lockdown. But nature has a funny way of positively deconstructing things. So already we have new ways of working, we have accelerated digitalization, resistance to change, something that we humans are prone to, but that's changing as well. And out of all of that has arisen this incredible growth in ESG investing. So before I get into the ESG topic, I'd like to acknowledge there are probably lots of people here who are sustainability officers, chief investment officers, and the like, risk officers, who feel that they're being pulled and dragged in all sorts of directions. And Steve and Mervyn made reference earlier on to the alphabet soup, you know, being pulled and dragged in terms of the different standards that are out there, having to answer multiple questionnaires, and having to contend with these new types of stakeholders that are appearing and asking new questions. And their KPIs really are generating 80-page, 100-page reports, supporting leadership in their investor meetings, things like that. And in the midst of all of this pressure, it's not made any easier when standards tell them, well, actually, within your industry sector, this is what matters most. This is the materiality that matters most. And that adds to their confusion. And as a result, the big risk here is that they end up focusing on everything other than what matters most to sustainability. And a question has to be asked about the efficacy, the quality of ESG data. Bottom line is today, and we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. We're at the nascent stages of ESG, really. But substantially, the data is just totally unreliable. There's a report from MIT Sloan on the project Aggregate Confusion. That's how MIT Sloan have defined ESG data: confused, aggregated data, comprised of lots of stuff, most of which is not independently verifiable and not auditable. And that's a problem. But the reason for it is as follows. Really, the raters and the aggregators are using different methodologies, but the companies themselves are using a multiplicity of standards and not disclosing in a very coherent way. And there's a kind of an alchemy taking place. Numbers are being mathematized because every time, and the people who are involved in the preparing of documents should understand this, every time you make a public disclosure, every time you're answering a questionnaire, there's an AI, a piece of artificial intelligence somewhere, that's scraping what you're saying. And that's going into a data field, and that's driving an index and so forth. And the reality is that not all of the data, and most of it, is not independently verifiable and not auditable. So, question, do multinational corporations, do they know what they know? Do they know what they don't know? If we think of the kind of global economy in terms of, so let's say we have the S&P 500 at the top. We have in the middle, we have 60,000 multinational corporations who directly control 500,000 subsidiaries. And collectively, that accounts for half of the global economy. And the rest of the world, essentially those sub-suppliers and so forth. What you have is a situation where a multinational corporation is really an extended corporation. It no longer does everything in-house. It is an extended series of nodes and relationships that are all very highly interconnected, highly interdependent, and totally vulnerable to this kind of very uncertain world that we now live in. And the simple truth is that multinational corporations, they're just too big to know what's going on across their systems, their ecosystems, these collections of companies and entities that are all required to collaborate, because to collaborate is to compete. And they're all collaborating to compete to achieve objectives. Now you might say, Peadar, that really is not very fair. So I would advocate what I would describe as the tell me, show me, prove it to me rule. At the tell me level, we're likely to have pretty impressive frameworks. You'd have to be giving 8, 9, maybe 10 out of 10 for these frameworks that exist, the committee structures and so forth. But at the show me level, you're finding that there are multiple systems and that there are gaps between the systems. And the filling of those gaps results in people with Excel spreadsheets and so forth. And that's the content that gets disclosed. And then at the prove it to me level, we get down to 1 out of 10 because there is no record of truth. There is no platform of truth. So when you're thinking about ESG, think in terms of your ability to understand what's going on across the organization. Think of a little bit, maybe the bear in the woods. You know, the joke, 2 guys in the woods. You don't have to be faster than the bear. You got to be faster than the other guy. And that's very important in the context of competing in a world that's growing in uncertainty. So imagine now for a moment, a multinational corporation. I'm guessing a lot of people on this call are members of those types of organizations, spread across regions and geographies. Now think for a moment, just think for one moment of the people spread across those organizations, and they're all seeing the same things. But because they're in different roles, they're all using different languages. And I don't mean French and English. I mean different technical languages, describing these common things that they're seeing. And they're concerned about all of these different things. But they're dispersed across the organization. And there's no method of all of that for all that information to be kind of aggregated, as it were. Now imagine for a moment, if those people were all recording the things that they're seeing and that concern them and tagging them with the E and the S impacts, the various capitals, financial, of course, reputational, and the other capitals. But in particular, tagging what matters most. That is the basic unit of currency of ESG measurement. What matters most to the fulfillment of an objective, either a business objective or an explicit ESG objective. And when you think about all of that information, because there is no collective knowing, there's no collective knowing, the result is that multinational corporations, they don't know what they know. People who have information aren't getting it to the people who need information. You have these unknown knowns that are traversing organizations at speed. That's what I call quantum risks. There's a technical paper on that, but that's not for discussion here. It's to describe the nature of the E, the S, and the G factors that are traversing across your organization. The takeaway here is that ESG risks are moving at speed across your ecosystem, your integrated organization, your extended organization. They are not static. And there's a risk for organizations that adopt this linear committee approach, which is a necessary, critical starting point in getting our head around what ESG involves. So my kind of concluding insights here are that there is a difference between what I would call pro forma sustainability reporting and reporting on what matters most to achieving objectives, your sustainability objectives across the entirety of your ecosystem. Pro forma reporting is likely to bring it down the rabbit holes, as it were. You will certainly fulfill your scope 1 and 2 reporting because that's the easy stuff, but scope 3, which is the extended organization, that's where the bodies are buried. And that's where most organizations are very, very challenged. So think of risk in terms of every time you're making a decision, you're managing a risk. The challenge in the case of ESG is this bottom-up view of what matters most to the achievement of your ESG targets and your business targets.